Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. So when I first started a YouTube channel and then a podcast, I did so because I have a worldview that I feel that I've benefited from, and I wanted to share it in the hope that other people might benefit from it as well. And there was a lot to say about it. And I feel like over the course of the last 99 episodes of the podcast and the videos I recorded before, I've fleshed it out. Most of the stuff is now on the table. The core ideas are, at least. And so for this, the 100th episode of the podcast, I wanted to kind of lay it out from start to finish in one place, instead of having it kind of scattered around in different places. So if we start at the beginning, when we think about what it is to exist, our place in reality, we inherently have to kind of face the issue of consciousness, because it's through consciousness that we know anything, know the world around us, know ourselves. And so the nature of consciousness necessarily involves the nature of reality and vice versa. You know, if this is a dream, that's a different image to the material being the only thing that exists and consciousness being an illusion. You know, these kinds of considerations are important when we're trying to look at the big picture of what's going on. So you can start with the observations of the world around us, but really, if you think about it, consciousness comes first in our experience. You know, first you are conscious, then we come together and we start doing science and philosophy and making sense of the world. So I think it makes sense to begin with consciousness. And for me, and based on my reading of kind of texts throughout history, I'm not the only person who feels this. When I introspect and when I kind of get very still, there's a recognition that at the center of what I am, and seemingly at the center of everything, given that I'm a kind of piece of existence, it seems this experience feels like it's not just what it feels like to be a biological thing, but what it is to exist. At the center, it feels like there is something that you might call like a potent void, a nothingness, a no thing, something that can't be conceptualized. You can't say it's this or that. But it's not a nothingness that's just void and empty and negation. Instead, it's a fullness. It's a kind of, infinity is a good word to use for it. If you think of what infinity is, it's not a thing. It's the kind of potent wellspring of everything. Now I've started with trying to talk about the one thing that's probably the most difficult thing to talk about in words, because we're talking about a kind of non-conceptual confrontation with experience and noticing what's at the center of the unfolding experience. And I don't think this is anything supernatural. I think this is my instinct is this is the bedrock of being, is that we find ourselves in an infinite process of becoming. Introspectively, you can feel this. But I think it maps onto a very sensible, naturalistic, statistical understanding of what it is to exist as well. So the way that I think about it is, if you ask the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Nothingness isn't really a stable state. It's probably the best way I can say it. If you want to justify where there's something rather than nothing, if there was something, if you take that assumption, then you've solved the question. There's nothing interesting to be explored there. The real question is, if there's nothingness, then how do you get somethingness? And so if you think about what the nature of nothingness is, it's non-existent. Its core attribute is that it doesn't exist. So it kind of, the concept of nothingness bites its own tail. And so nothingness can't exist. So the idea of there being nothingness forever, for infinity in all dimensions you can think of, not just in time, it's not really a stable concept. It doesn't really make sense. So the way that I think about it is, because it seems plausible to me that there could have been nothing ever arising. But, and I'm not just trying to play some conceptual game here of definitions of nothingness. I'm reaching for something that I intuitively find kind of satisfying. And that's this idea that if it was possible for anything to ever happen anywhere in existence, that possibility is all you need to then get the game going now of the universe running through all the infinite permutations that it can possibly be in, which is the way I kind of think about what's happening. So you have nothingness as not a stable state, and in that nothingness, if there's any chance of anything ever happening, as soon as that happens, if you're interested in existence, then actually you would zoom in on that. The nothingness isn't part of the non-existent isn't part of your consideration of existence. So it's almost as if there's any chance of anything ever happening, that swells to fill all of existence, because it is the thing that exists. And so this fits with an idea of the universe as a kind of, almost like a computational device, in that it's something that's running through different permutations of what's possible, and that would come out of this infinite nothingness that is potent because of this what I'm calling infinite here, this non-constrained, unbounded nature of nothingness. Because if it's nothing, it can't have rules, it can't have boundaries, it can't have laws. So this is how I think of this kind of fertile wellspring of existence that I feel that we can notice when we introspect, that our circumstance is that we are in this flow of this infinite becoming. And my instinct is that given when we look at the kind of frontier of what we can observe, whether it's the continent one happens to be on, and then you go across the water and you find another continent, or exploration of space, there always seems to be more beyond what we can initially observe. And so there's the amount of the universe. Well, there's the thing we call the universe, which is what we can observe from where we are. And so it seems to me you can infer from this pattern that there probably are other universes just beyond what we can see. You can't know that for certain, but it seems very plausible and very natural to me to assume a kind of multiverse. And so I think of this, what I'm describing here isn't just how you get from the Big Bang to the heat death of the universe. It's a process that presumably is eternal. And so after the heat death of the universe, I don't know enough about black holes and things, but I know there's models in which new universes can be born, and there's a kind of big bounce, and these kinds of cyclical models of the universe, kind of mirroring the Big Bang. So I think that, to me, it intuitively feels right that there's not to assert boundaries that bracket existence doesn't feel right to me, because the things that exist on either side of those brackets, the nothingness, isn't a stable thing, a stable state. So this sense of kind of eternalism for me is very important. I think it's it's an important thing to connect with, and it's something you find a lot in spiritual texts, this sense of the present moment being a portal to the infinite, which I think was a phrase that the psychedelic pioneer Bill Richards used when I interviewed him for the podcast. So when some people engage in kind of contemplative practices or have mystical experiences through other means, there can be this feeling that I think they connect with this thing I'm talking about. And there can be a kind of reifying of the importance of consciousness, that really what's at the core of the universe is consciousness, is awareness. My instinct is they're talking about the same phenomenon that I am. But to me, there's this more intangible, this more slippery thing that I'm calling kind of potent void, was I think the first phrase I used. And it's more slippery, more, you can't slap a concept on it really comfortably, as you might get from trying to call it something like a potent void. So, the reason I think people project their own consciousness onto the universe is, I think of the origin of life, abiogenesis, as kind of like the horizon for what we are. So it's like our own Big Bang, where when we introspect, we can't feel what it would have felt like to be the kind of evolving wave function of the entire universe or an individual particle. The first time I think feeling came into existence is with bounded living systems. And so if that's when the lights came on, by definition, we can't feel back to what it would have felt like before that. So I feel like when people become very grounded in existence in these states, they're really grounded in the emergent level of being a living system. They're not grounded in the level of physics. We can't really connect with quarks and, those things that make us up experientially. So yeah, this is one of the reasons, not the only reason, that I'm not an idealist. I'm not someone who thinks only consciousness exists, but I sympathize with the kinds of experiences I think people are having that lead them to think this. It's when we come back to conceptualizing stuff that I think, to me, it doesn't add up, that consciousness is the fundamental thing that's going on. And so in my picture, in the living mirror theory picture, consciousness is a kind of relational process. It's this phrase that was used by lots of people, from Alan Watts to Carl Sagan, of us being a way for the universe to know itself. So we're relating to the universe as a piece of the universe, and it's in that relational dynamic that living systems come to experience and know the rest of the world, and through that the world wakes up through us. And when I say us, I mean all living things, saying that with a sense of kinship with everything from plants to bacteria. So in this picture, consciousness isn't a thing. It's not a substance. It's a relational process. It's important not to reify it as something that exists. And I think that also helps with lots of philosophical problems when you if you think of matter as a substance and mind as a substance, then you're going to have issues of thinking of how can one generate the other. But actually, to me, I don't think of either of them as a substance. I think reality is a process, and when we look at it and we quantify it, we call that matter, we call that objective, the way of engaging with the world that exists in between us, that's publicly observable. And then there's this other aspect that's private. When I taste the taste of an orange, you're not tasting it. It's happening in my consciousness. So there's this qualitative, subjective side of this process as well. And to me, I think that's satisfying. You don't need to then, if you're thinking of them as substances, then you are going to have an issue trying to derive one from the other. But if they're two aspects of a process, then I don't think there's any problem there. So then you have this picture in which there's this process and it becomes living systems. And eventually you get to the kind of mundane everyday experience of the world, where you wake up and you make yourself a drink and you make food, and it doesn't feel like you are a kind of cosmic principle of the evolution of the universe waking up to itself. So why, if that's what's going on, why does it feel so kind of familiar and mundane and routine day to day? Well, I think in the process of I think it might be due to the fact that we genuinely do exist, and to separate from the world as a living system is an incredibly high stakes act, because it's like you're creating a kind of a high wire act for yourself, in that your circumstance is precarious inherently, and so there's this intensity to feeling yourself to be a living system because the stakes are so high. Not ultimately, not objectively, it doesn't matter in the end, but the game that you're playing as a living system is to be concerned with your own survival. So kind of, again, by definition, you're putting yourself in a circumstance that you desperately care about your own survival. So to exist is this intense thing. And one of the ways that we cope with that is we evolve strategies for navigating the world, and that involves conceptualizing, discriminating things, becoming familiar with them, habituating to stuff that's around. And all of these processes lead us to your everyday experience of the world, which is everything's under control. I may be an evolving physical process in an uncertain world, but I've predicted the room that I'm in so accurately that actually it's all under control. The ship is sailing in the right direction. So this kind of process of conceptualizing and building on models really experientially feels like it takes down the intensity. But then if you have a mystical experience, or say, I think a good example would be with a strong psychedelic like 5-MeO-DMT, where people have these very immediate mystical experiences, what I think is happening there is all of your ability to hold on to those models and feel like everything's being predicted successfully, that gets stripped away through the action of this chemical in the brain. And then you're confronted with what's really going on, this high stakes, intense process of being a living system that's very grounded in being a part of the evolving universe. And so then you have this experience that can't really be accurately put into words, but it's intense. It feels like you connect with, people often describe being shot to the center of the universe with this experience. And it feels like you're in touch with this potent void that I was describing, the non-conceptual nature of reality. And I think the reason these mystical experiences can be healing is they can be so grounding, which is not, if you think of grounding, that may be a surprising thing to say about psychedelic experience, because a lot of people can really become ungrounded conceptually and get into kind of delusional ways of thinking. But I think that's almost a rebound effect to the fact that your models have been down regulated, and you're put in touch so deeply with your nature as a living thing, as a kind of unfolding physical process, that in the moment of the experience is incredibly grounding, but almost too grounding, I think, too much too soon for some people. And then the mind needs to kind of needs to grab onto certain concepts and use those to reassure the organism that it's going to be okay, because something incredibly intense happened. And with the concepts going offline, that naturally raises a kind of a concern for the organism that it's not going to be able to successfully navigate the world if that happens again. So when we come out of such an experience and we need to reassure ourselves, I think people can often project their own emotional needs onto the universe. So I think a lot of the time, this is where supernatural religious ideas of deities and very reassuring narratives of life after death and things like that come in a lot of the time. I also think in these experiences, sometimes you do just have full-on deity encounters. So there's also just that someone feels like they've seen something. I tend to think of those as archetypal things that are part of our deep programming, rather than things that exist out there in the world. And also there's a sense of, when you lose your sense of self in these experiences and you identify with the unfolding of the universe, there is a sense of life after death where you feel, okay, I don't need to be in this egoic, fear-based psychology that's based in being a living system that's concerned with my death. I can actually let go of that attachment and just identify with this deeper principle. So it's not always kind of emotionally motivated, I think. But given our circumstance as living systems that have goals by virtue of our being alive and being kind of goal-directed systems, the absurdism of existence, the fact that the broader scheme is not aligned with our species level, individual level, biological level goals, the kind of inherent chaos and of existence, it leads us into it can be quite an intense thing to confront. And so it makes sense that people would seek escapism in reassuring narratives. But I think it's important to stay in touch with the absurd, with the fact that any kind of tragedy could befall anyone at any moment. And instead of hiding from that and pretending, there are multiple ways people can deny that this is an issue. From, a common one would be to say that our everyday experience of the world is something like an illusion, and actually there's a transcendent reality. That's a common interpretation of these experiences. I think it's important to not turn away from our everyday lived experience and to confront it. And to me, the solution to that difficulty we experience there is, one is emotional health, learning to feel, to not resist what it makes you feel. And usually, the reason we can't do, if we find it hard to feel that, then it's because there's some trauma in the system, something has happened that's overwhelming, and so there needs to be some therapeutic process to release that trauma. And this is the process of coming into emotional health and being able to sit with those feelings, but also approach them with a sense of non-attachment, where there's a letting go and an understanding that this is just the unfolding of the world. So it's a kind of getting out of the egoic mindset, really, to me, is the wise way to approach our circumstance, that leads you to feeling, the reason I think it's wise is it leads you to feeling very grounded, very non-neurotic. You're not running around reifying beliefs or acting in ways to manage your stress of the situation. You're dealing with the stress, processing it, sitting with it, accepting it. And so to me, grounding is a really metaphysically kind of important idea. And really a lot of what I'm talking about here comes down to grounding. And when we do that, the experience of love that we feel when you move into a state of complete acceptance, you can describe this non-attached, intimate acceptance of everything that arises in consciousness as love, or precisely as kind of unconditional love, because not that I really think there is another kind of love, but if you think about it, it's the same thing. It's openness, acceptance, warmth, welcoming, and this dynamic of getting into this love state is one of the most powerful things I've ever experienced, and it's profoundly healing because it takes you in this grounding direction. It just feels like if there's an arrow that's pointing in the correct direction for living, it's labeled love. That's the most important instruction, and will take you into all these non-dual states of deep grounding and openness and connection and trauma healing, and it's just the direction we all want to be moving in. And because of its effect on connection, it takes us into kind of social concerns as well. And I hesitate in this space to kind of get into political things sometimes, because there are a few things that can be more of a turn-off than having someone just tell you what their political opinions are, especially when they differ from yours. But I think when it comes to this process of individual liberation, really is how I think about it, liberation from suffering, finding freedom, I think there is a corresponding material process, because the relative level of everyday existence does also exist as a relative phenomenon. You can't just transcend your way out of the situation. If you're homeless and you're being brutalized by the system, and it's not giving you an ability to have basic necessity to live, those material circumstances are blocking you there. It doesn't stop you from accessing these states, but then in terms of integrating them and the actual project of getting free is hindered. And so I think there is a corresponding material project socially, and I see my own instincts around this best mirrored in the political tradition of anarchism, especially things like Tolstoy's Christian anarchism. And while I'm not a kind of a Christian, I draw a lot of inspiration from the teachings around love of Jesus, and I think that a kind of spiritual anarchism that's based around a recognition of our shared humanity and of what we all deeply care about above anything is our own felt sense of freedom and ability to be at peace and to have our needs met. And so I think there is a corresponding project there. I also think it's actually, to bring us back to the idea of eternalism, I think it's an eternal project. The reason I think it's necessary is that it's very easy for us to be heavy-handed and to try and pin things down and get things under control. That's a very kind of immature, instinctive first, your first thought, something if you feel afraid and out of control, is just lock everything down, even if it's unwise and causes more problems. This is what we see in fascism, Nazi Germany after the destruction of the First World War. There's this desire to get everything under control, and the corresponding processes of scapegoating people to try and get your emotions under control. And we see how deeply unwise, to say the least, that is, leading to genocide of millions. Unfortunately, that comes very easily to us in certain circumstances. And so I think there needs to be the wise direction to move in is to talk and share and think about the wisdom of how we can live peacefully and how we can maximize liberation for everyone and freedom and reduce domination and heavy-handed control. To me, it's a corresponding social project of moving the direction of non-attachment and allowing and reducing fear is a complete correspondence in my mind, which is why I'm mentioning it now. And it also forces you to confront, when we're talking about control, you're not even allowing yourself to have the comfort of the control of an ideology. When you have an ideology, you think, at least in your head, you've got things straight and there's some level of control. In the same way that with the kind of spiritual stuff, a lot of these terms point to something beyond themselves, that they point towards the non-conceptual. I think of this politically as in the same way, where it's not like you have an ideology that you want to force on other people. It's actually to the extent that you use concepts and that there is an ideology, it points beyond ideology and into allowing and into diversity and into not having the answers. And it requires people to do this kind of inner work to feel okay with that. And then through that process, I think we can harness the organization that comes with complex processes that find their own balance, find their appropriate order, because they're not fragile and being pinned down through excessive control. And I think historically, this is the process that's led us to where we are now, is that fear and trauma and conflict is what pushes us into egoic separation and needing things to be pinned down and under control. And that process, if you look geographically at Eurasia, where colonization and the making of the modern world it came from, I think geographically it seems just through things like the different river valleys where agriculture could arise, and then the kind of hoarding of resources could happen, and then the steppe plains that made it possible for people to travel long ways on horses and engage in conflict and plundering, and also the fact that the continent stretches east to west rather than north to south like the Americas makes it possible for people who live in one habitat to travel widely. So I think for these kind of geographical and kind of historically coincidental reasons, there are certain places where there was lots of conflict, and that pushes us into a mode of egoic self-defense. And so I think we've seen this kind of play out historically, but I actually think it kind of, this process may actually be coming to an end. And I'm not saying this from a kind of instinctively optimistic place, but as far as I can see, this kind of plundering, expansionist, colonizing dynamic that persecutes other people, it seems to have arisen with the Proto-Indo-European speaking peoples of the Eurasian steppe. And you see this from the fact that the majority of people in the world now speak a Proto-Indo-European language, as I am right now. And so these people clearly expanded very massively, first through the Eurasian continent and then through colonization. And so their culture, which seemed to be one of raiding on horseback, places that were far away, it worked as a strategy for expansion and domination. And so this is one point, is that in certain circumstances, domination works in the same way that cancer's growing works from the perspective of the cancer growing, if that's what it wants to achieve. And so there's like a statistical thing where cultures that do that, in certain circumstances, more likely to expand and spread. But it depends on there being an in-group and an out-group. It depends on the domestication of the horse in this particular example to be able to go way outside of your community and hurt other people and exploit them, because we evolved to have very strong instincts to not want to plunder our own family and friends. It just doesn't, we're not built that way. And so if this is a reasonable analysis, then it suggests that the stage we're at now, where we're a globally interconnected culture, it's like we're back in the village. We're in a global village where we're confronting the fact that we instinctively don't allow each other to plunder in our own community. And so I think the kind of political conversations we're having now, the amazing amount of rights that have been won over the last century, I think this is us getting back in our instinctive ability to reason with each other and to keep each other well regulated in a healthy way. I think these basic capacities we have as humans are coming back to the fore. And so it actually gives me hope that in the same way we see wise practices in indigenous cultures, maybe in the future, out of necessity, we'll have a wise global civilization. I mean, long term, we would have to, if the ones that survive will have to be wise and not based on instinctive control processes that are fragile. And so the project of making this happen, it's going to go the way it's going to go. And so I take inspiration from what's called the Bodhisattva path in Buddhism, where you seek your own personal liberation, not to transcend and leave everyone alone, but then to return to the world and act from a place of helping out of your nature as a human. You feel empathy for people suffering. You know that in the absolute perspective, it's all just happening. It's all going to go the way it's going to go. But actually the most aligned thing you can do is to respond to what you're instinctively feeling. And so living a life of service and trying to contribute because it's your authentic desire is completely aligned with non-attachment. You can have this grounded acceptance of not neurotically needing the process to go one way or another, but also you can help and contribute. And to me, that's where this kind of inner work of the individual and collective improvement goes hand in hand. So thank you for sticking around to the end. I hope this has been interesting. And thank you for sticking around with the podcast. 100 episodes now. And I deeply appreciate that there's a community of people like yourself who find these ideas interesting and hopefully get some value and benefit from them. Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.